It would be really easy to look at today's text about the raising of Lazarus and see the focus as being on the resurrection, because when we see where it lies in the Gospel of John, it seems clear that it points to another resurrection that's coming. That's the resurrection of Jesus himself. But placed here today in the text for All Saints' Day, I don't think that's what it's meant to evoke. Don't think that's what All Saints' Day is about. The day is about acknowledging and remembering all those who came before us. And it's a way to make them alive again, in a sense, through our own memory. The Lazarus story is about that, but it's much more of a physical way of thinking about those who've died as being potentially alive and with us again. Theologian Eric Smith says of this text that we have to think about how the past talks to the future and how the future holds the present hostage, to think about how the text is speaking to that in some way. And to that, Yogi Berra, one of the saints who went on this year, once said, "The future ain't what it used to be." But what do we mean when we evoke the past? All Saints' Day is a way to talk about the present and the future by talking about the past. We point to those who have come before us as a way of talking about who we are. It's a way of talking about who we want to be. Today, you have brought someone or someones with you into this room. And there simply aren't enough chairs in this space to offer the hospitality we need to grant. They are with us, they are real and close enough that we might feel some of the residual despair that Mary felt when she knelt at Jesus' feet and said, "Lord, if you had just been here. If you had just been here, this death would not have occurred. If you had been here, I would not be mourning a grief I did not know could be possible. If you had only made yourself known, I would not be alone now without my best friend, my spouse, my child. If I could have been given something a little more in which to believe." And all around her, too, we're weeping in solidarity, as we still do when there's been a great loss, when we meet in rooms like this. Many of us have met in this one in particular, singing and praying and extolling and caring and feeding and sitting with those left behind. Today is the day we remember. I remember. And I suspect you do too. And during communion today, you're invited to come up and light a candle here in remembrance. And so today I just have a little story to tell. 4 years ago, I backpacked through French Canada and Nova Scotia with my grandmother. She wasn't with me physically. In fact, she died in 1976. I didn't know it at the time, but I think it was an act of veneration, of unfinished business, a way of being with my grandmother one more time, and it didn't have to be on a specific Sunday set aside for honoring those who've gone on, important as this is. I took a night train to Halifax from Quebec after just breathing that city in. Sat on the train listening to Leonard Cohen on my iPod and the rhythm of the tracks below. I rented a car and headed west to the Bay of Fundy. On my way, I remembered this woman that I grew up with. She was born in 1885. She was born in rural Nova Scotia. She was not a worldly person ever, but she played every kid's game with me, and we spent hours at her card table in her room playing Kings on the Corner, while I heard about living on a farm without electricity as one of 13 kids. What chores were like, what it was like sometimes to go without or make do. How it was to have all the kids climb up on the lower roof of the barn at night and recline back and be a part of the stars and sometimes the northern lights in the Acadian skies, while the land around reverberated to the sound of the crickets and the otherwise hush of darkness. How to chase fireflies and catch them in a jar and make a lantern and cover it with a screen tied around with string and sit in the evening grass, chasing your dreams about whom you might one day be. What it was like to instantly lose a brother in a farming accident and a sister to a disease that no one dies from anymore. And how close and present death was on a farm. Your cemetery plot is where you found your extended family, and they were visited on Sunday after services at the Baptist church. And when she told these stories, she smiled a little too broadly and talked a little too matter-of-factly. It was still raw and present, living at her side years later next to her sewing basket. And so I decided that I needed to see her farm as a way of honoring her and acknowledging that I appreciated the stories that she told me, and more than that, the love and the care that she gave me without holding back. She had been the person who had watched over me growing up, just as you had that person, or you had that teacher, or you had that mentor, or that friend, or that spouse, whoever it might be, you're thinking of them right now. Anne Sexton once said, "Saints have no moderation, nor do poets, just exuberance." You know that's true because you're sitting next to them today. Exuberance is one of the first things I remember in my saints, don't you? Or maybe they weren't that exuberant. Maybe it was just those enthusiastic moments that stood out, and that's what we remember. Dan Millman said that saints were saints because they acted with loving kindness, whether they felt it or not. Bear River, Nova Scotia, 25 kilometers. The sign read, and Cousin Ike, a man I'd never met, was waiting for me in his truck at the appointed fork in the road because it all gets too rural after that to find anything. He took me to his modest home, swung out of his truck on his two crutches, and led me into where I met his family, and I realized my family, second cousins I'd never seen, come from here and there that day for an early supper in the big kitchen with the best red checker tablecloths. Family. They're everywhere. He and I then got in the truck and drove up to the fields where the descendants of the family horses raced alongside of the truck. And then down, deep down an old road where he stopped at a farmhouse and made his way on aching hips to a door. The woman who answered invited us in, and in the front hallway was an impressive gun rack from the floor up to my chest. And it was full of rifles with one missing spot, and I remember her saying her husband was out in the field. And above the shotguns was an old oil painting of a decrepit 3-story Victorian house with a title on the frame that read, "The Old Haunted House on Sisaboo Road." And the owner listened as Otis told the tale. After the family sold this end of the property in 1917, the house was left to sag and decay in what finally fell and became woods next door. For decades, it was used as a hunting shack, a shelter for men hunting deer. Finally, it was flattened and burned down by the county. The new owner of the property turned to me and she said, "She has met so many grandchildren who have come back to see this place. She doesn't know why. We're always welcome, but just remember, it's just a hole in the ground next door. That's all it is, just a hole in the ground. But if I'm ever back this way again, stop in." And driving a bit down the way of the road, Otis counted something I couldn't see and stopped the truck. He said, "Get out here and walk 50 paces straight through the tall grass towards that single tree growing there." And I realized I was walking through the tall weeds in the woods across what was my grandmother's front lawn where children played and gathered fireflies at night. The tree was growing straight up from the cellar of the stone foundation of her house, where inside lies nothing now but charred wood, a rusty bed spring, and the remains of an antiquated icebox. Ike dropped me back at my car, and I thanked him profusely. The next day, I retraced my route, and I found the place again. I stood inside that ruined foundation and thought about how my grandmother lived there with 12 siblings and a mother and a father, and what life must have been like in such a cramped place. And though the land was still so vast, the house could not have been comfortable for so many people. And yet the stories she told were all so woven with how close, how many things they did together, how much love was shared in that little foundation, 3 stories tall, although it might have been. And a wide pipe that might once have been red stood not far from the side of the house. And I pictured my grandmother pumping water just like she said she did for chores. New life has grown up like wild plantings in a beautiful pot made of recycled stones that now support a different kind of house. I thought I would want to stay here for a while, but I felt that I did not belong, nor did I sense a kinship with this place, because the earth was slowly taking back what no longer belongs to the living. And then a trip to Mount Hope Cemetery, the church long gone, in Bear River, revealed the graves of family members, including my great-grandparents. And the grave includes the dashing young soldier Valentine, who died in World War I, who rests with his little daughter, who died in a house fire. And the sound of Bear River rushes along deep down, down, down the embankment. And it fills the emptiness of this lonely place. And it is here now, the homestead even more so lonely. And I drove on and away back to life in the here and now, because it's the only place to which we are called to occupy and live in fully. I'm glad I saw it, and blessings upon it for what it meant to those saints, including she who went on before, but being there pointed out that we only belong in the present. You know that, don't you? We only belong in the here and the now. We never belong in the past. And we all feel these losses that make us feel that emptiness deep inside. And for some, I know, especially now, that loss feels very fresh. Mary's words, "Lord, if you had only been here, if you had only been here, this might not have happened," may well resonate. The Reverend Shelley Williams is a United Methodist minister who, writing about today's text, says, "The truth is, on some level, we are all lifeless at times. We are all bound by things in this world that literally just suck the life out of us." If you think about it in the story, it's a story about the raising of Martha as well. It's a story about the raising of Mary and all of those who loved Lazarus, raised out of grief to hope and to life. We are always in the process of and actually becoming a new creation. And the story of this raising is more than a miracle. It is the stuff that we are made of. I might paraphrase her as she talks about where Jesus weeps and say that all of us might weep for us too. Weep that we hurt. Weep that we get so wrapped up in the minutia of life that makes us forget who at our core we are. Weep that we are not who we are called to be. This is a story about the in-between. And yes, this is the story of the shortest sentence in the Bible. Jesus wept. And so come to this table today, unafraid to walk with the one you came with, unafraid to honor someone who helped make you who you are. We point to those who come before us as a way of talking about who we are and who we want to be. And Frederick Buechner once said that in God's holy flirtation with the world, God occasionally drops a handkerchief, and those handkerchiefs are called saints. Unaware on a conscious level at the time, I carefully buckled a dear lady into a rental car in Halifax and drove her home where she was a child. Who did you bring with you today to honor and remember? Bring him, bring her, bring them home to this table today. And come for all things are ready.